I was struck in particular by one thing that Norman Finkelstein said opening one of his sessions. He described the experience of being what he called a Marxist-Leninist in code, ordinary language. What that means is a Maoist. And he describes the effect of not the death of Mao, but the death of Mao plus then the arrest of the so-called Gang of Four, which of course included Mao's widow and the rise to power of Deng Xiaoping. And he described the effect that it had on him personally. I can't remember exactly how many days he stayed in bed, suffering from depression, but he also described his teacher, famous Maoist, Bettelheim. I think you came across him, didn't you, Yasmin? I presume in Paris? Yeah, famous Maoist guy. He wrote a whole series of volumes basically showing how the Soviet Union was capitalist, right? China, of course, was socialist, right? But after the death of Mao, and as I said, the arrest of the Gang of Four, apparently he went into, I suppose, clinical depression for 3 years. Right? Now, in 1991, as everyone knows, the Soviet Union collapsed, it disintegrated. We saw the formation of the, Confederation of Independent States. We haven't got it on our book stall, but we got together in our organisation a collection of articles that I'd written up to that moment, and we entitled it From October to August. And in many senses, I have to say, when I bother to go back to that particular book, I get a bit of a satisfaction. There's lots wrong with it, I readily accept that. But in terms of what happened, in terms of counter-revolution, disintegration, the restoration of some sort of capitalism, it was not going to be Swedish or Canadian capitalism, of that we were certain. And also sort of the why we were going towards this particular scenario. I have to say that in many senses we were vindicated, certainly against our opponents in official communism of all varieties who just formed before Gorbachev. There was an editorial in the Morning Star written by the late Tony Chater that called Gorbachev the modern-day Lenin. You had people like Jerry Healy, you had people like Ernest Mandel talking about this is Trotsky's political revolution. I suppose the most bizarre one I've ever come across was actually Tariq Ali, who wrote a book called Revolution from Above. You open it up, it's dedicated to, I don't know whether it's Comrade Boris Yeltsin, but the book is dedicated to Yeltsin. Anyway, far from, how should you put it, basking in the glory, being at least proved partially right. It's true that we were hoping, praying, desperately hoping for some sort of movement by the working class that never really happened in any meaningful sense. Far from, in that sense, resting on our laurels, it was in that year that I went back to studying the Soviet Union. And I've been studying the Soviet Union since 1991. I can't remember what year it was I produced a draft of a book. I think we gave it out at some Corfu school or some school we had abroad. Anyway, the point would be that what I was writing in the 1980s really was journalism. It wasn't theoretical, it wasn't getting really to the roots of things, and I think we need to get to the roots of things. Because if 1917 was the most important event, and I would argue it is, that's ever happened in class society, the defeat of 1917 and how it was defeated surely deserves the most profound study that we're capable of doing. Okay, let's just take a step back. The idea of the Russian Revolution, I would guess from about the 1870s, certainly the 1880s, was a commonplace. Everyone knew it was coming. You know, the whole of sort of leftish, liberal opinion in Europe had sympathy for the Russian revolutionaries. Conan Doyle, if you read some of his Sherlock Holmes, you've got Sherlock Holmes being sympathetic to Russian narodniks, and one can carry on with examples. And in that sense, if you take the last joint preface of the Communist Manifesto written by Marx and Engels, I think it was for the Russian edition in 1881, they are predicting the Russian Revolution. And indeed they warn in that about the danger of a global war. They're convinced if that comes, monarchies will fall, but the cause of socialism will be thrown back. So the fact that Tsarism visibly lived in crisis, visibly was haunted by its, how should I put it, its death, gave courage, gave, how should I put it, encouraged absolute dedication of revolutionaries to the cause of making revolution. They knew it would be soon, they didn't know when, but they were absolutely confident, and obviously rightly confident, that Tsarism was nearing the end of its days. Well, as well as producing bravery of the sort that we saw with Lenin's brother, who didn't either toss a bomb in the direction of the Tsar or take a few shots and suffered the consequences, i.e. he was hung, as well as acts of bravery, it also encouraged thinking, and it encouraged bold thinking. If you take Plekhanov, he was the first guy to come along with the idea that in backward Russia, the conditions are becoming ripe for the working class to actually lead this revolution. This would not be, as an Narodniks thought, for good reason, a revolution led by the intelligentsia at the front of the peasant masses. What you could have is the working class at the head of the peasant masses. Has to be said, as far as I understand it, that Marx himself was quite skeptical about Plekhanov. I'm not particularly sure of what struggles were going on internationally at the time, but to suffice to say, it was Plekhanov who was then joined by the next generation of Marxist revolutionaries, i.e. most notably Lenin, that took up that idea. And of course what marked out Lenin and the Bolsheviks was specifically their attitude to the peasantry and therefore also the bourgeoisie. In their analysis, Russia is ripe for what they called a bourgeois revolution, but the bourgeoisie were too cowardly, too weak, too compromised to play anything else other than a counter-revolutionary role. So the Bolshevik wing of what became the RSDLP orientated to the peasants, to ensuring proletarian hegemony over a peasant revolution. What became the Mensheviks did retain faith that given it was a bourgeois revolution, it had to be led by the bourgeoisie, and the job of the working class was to push, to encourage, perhaps on certain occasions to lead the bourgeoisie in its predetermined historic mission. Now we need to understand, in terms of this particular formula, that Lenin, in spite of some people saying to the contrary, had no idea of making the bourgeois revolution with the proletariat and then handing over to the bourgeoisie. That was not in his schema at all. What Lenin was marked out by is the idea that Russia, led by the working class, with the peasantry behind it, would institute what he called the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, in which the proletariat would be the leading class, not because of its numbers, but because it's concentrated in cities and because of its culture and organisation. But that wasn't all. What also he was banking on, gambling on, if you want, was that Russia, backward Russia, would be the spark for the European revolution. Russia was not seen in isolation. Russia was not seen as just catching up with England in 1640 or America in 1776 or France in 1789. Russia was seen in the context of global capitalism, and it was seen in the context of advanced capitalism. So Lenin, yes, was banking on the German Revolution, the Austrian Revolution, the French Revolution, the British proletarian revolution to come to their rescue. Now, in terms of what happened, we know that the Russian Revolution ended up isolated. It's just worthwhile quoting the first edition of Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, which was published in 1924. I think it was sort of spring. I'm not quite sure of the precise date, but it's early 1924, and in that January, was it as early as January? Okay, right, great, thanks, Joe. In that edition of that pamphlet, Stalin said something to the effect, is socialism possible in one country? And basically the answer he gave was negative. No, you cannot have socialism in one country. By the time the second edition came out, later in 1924, you asked the question, is socialism possible in one country? And the answer was yes, it is possible, as long as we have the support of other revolutions later. But fundamentally, he's coming out and saying, yes, it is possible. It's almost as if, I don't know if you remember, Chris, Tony Cliff's volume on Rosa Luxemburg. It's a very famous edition, because what you've got, because we were all poorer in those days than we are now, because printing was so much more expensive, what the IS did is get a wrong passage. It wasn't a textual mistake, it was a political change of mind by the author Tony Cliff. And they got hold of the correction and glued it in the book. That's right. Well, it's almost, if Stalin and the Communist Party had been poor, it's almost as if they got a bit of a sticky and put it over that particular text.
I am absolutely convinced.
Exactly. I'm absolutely convinced of one thing one day, and I'm absolutely convinced of the other, without any accounting. Right? I don't mind people changing their minds. They're stupid if they don't change their minds, if they think they're wrong. But just admit it and explain why. Now, as I understand it, Ben might know this, that most other leaders of the Communist Party did not rate Stalin high in terms of being a theoretician or a big thinker. right? They certainly rated him, and anyone who dismisses organisational or political abilities would have been a fool. He was a top-rank organiser. He wasn't General Secretary of the Communist Party for nothing, right? So when he published this second edition, as I understand it, most people sort of looked at each other with a slight embarrassment. You know, it's a bit like a younger brother coming along and making, you know, trying to do a bit of Marxism, but basically making some fundamental errors. You know, you take a bit, he will learn sort of idea, you know. And as I understand it, the first individual, significant individual to actually cross swords with this idea was Grigory Zinoviev in the book, because you've read it.
No,
you're telling me it's pretty poor.
Yeah, no,
anyway,
Lars read it. So.
Okay, Lars has read it. Anyway, something like Leninism, anyway. It might even be called Leninism. There you are. Anyway, basically, in that book, Zinoviev, which is written 25, takes issue with Stalin and the idea of socialism in one country. This is just a basic error in Marxism. Doesn't he know anything? And Trotsky, I think, takes up that question. Jerry should know. I think a year later, but it was certainly after Zinoviev. That's the point. Anyway, I'll come back to that whole question. The reason I'm bringing this up is because quite clearly what we have with Stalin is at least the germs of a different course. It's the germ of not relying on Germany, but basically relying on what exists within Russia to build that up. That didn't mean he'd abandoned the idea of revolutions happening in other countries, but the centre of his strategy, so the centre, the core of his strategy now lay in economic development. That's the sort of direction he's going in. Now, initially, we all know the factional lineups. First of all, you've got an alliance of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, and you would guess that Kamenev and Zinoviev would have viewed themselves as the senior partners within what was called the Triumvirate. They were the ones that basically took over after Lenin had died in 24, or for that matter, was out of politics really for most of 24. You then have Trotsky and his comrades. Trotsky, worthwhile thinking, trying us to get in the heads of other Bolsheviks, joined the Bolshevik Party March, was it? 1917? July, there you are. And yes, he came, wasn't he? He came to Russia in March, and then you had this period of him collaborating with the Bolsheviks, getting in.
That's what he says.
Well, okay. All we know anyway is that Trotsky joins the Bolsheviks in 1917, goes on to play a leading role, becomes head of the Red Army, brilliantly successful in the Civil War. But you can imagine what other leading Bolsheviks might have thought of Trotsky. The Bolsheviks, in terms of their language, used the language of the French Revolution. So the idea of Bonapartism, the idea of a Napoleon, the idea of a man on a white horse. I noticed the other day Jerry's T-shirt, Trotsky on his white horse as the Soviet version of St. George, slaying the capitalist dragon. Yes, that was produced in the early 20s, and you can imagine what others therefore thought of Trotsky. They would have feared that Bonapartist temptation, that possibility in Trotsky. But having kicked out, to all intents and purposes, Zinoviev and Kamenev from the core of the regime, Stalin aligns himself with Bukharin, Nikolai Bukharin. Now, Bukharin had been, throughout the sort of tens and teens, a left communist. He was a left communist in 1918. He was one of these guys that published a paper, wasn't it called? left communist? Or maybe it was called communist. That's right. Anyway, he flipped, and he became the chief advocate of the policy which is known as New Economic Policy. After the Civil War, Russia was in ruins, and instead of pursuing, grain requisitions from the peasantry, basically the Bolsheviks retreated and said we have to reintroduce elements of the market. So the relationship between town and countryside was going to be characterized by the market. And the chief advocates of that were Bukharin and Stalin. And the idea would be, if you don't do that, you break the alliance between the working class and the peasantry. Because what the Bolsheviks, what I should say, is what the communists did in the Civil War, would basically turn up to a village, say you've got grain, the cities are starving, we'll take the grain, we'll leave you enough, hopefully not to starve, but we are taking it to stop the cities starving. So apparently the peasants came up with the slogan, we like the Bolsheviks because they gave us land. Remember Lenin's slogan, land, bread and peace. Peasants seized the land, that was encouraged by the Bolsheviks. They then legislated that into law. But then the communists, having Bolsheviks changed their name from the RSDLP, brackets B, sort of a type idea, called themselves communists and forcibly took the grain. Anyway, the point I want to get to is that this system was a malfunctioning system. Whatever grain the peasants were producing, the cities were not producing enough in the way of stuff that the peasantry wanted at the price the peasantry could afford. So what you see in the late 20s is a series of grain crises. And under the leadership of Stalin in particular, the communists resort to the same sort of methods, or increasingly the same sort of methods that we saw in the Civil War. Anyway, what we then have is Stalin in 1928 announcing the 5-year plan. He also announced a drive towards collectivization. Initially, all of this was pretty damned ambitious. There was going to be collectivization. That was all, of course, going to be voluntary. Of course it was going to be voluntary. The peasants would be encouraged to come together, pool their resources. Industry would be driven forward. Therefore, agriculture could be mechanized because you're building up still plants, tractor plants, and all the rest of it. Some on the left of the party were completely convinced that what Stalin had done had taken the program of Trotsky and Preobrazhensky and made it his own. Previously, Bukharin and Stalin had denounced Trotsky and his economist, Preobrazhensky, as super industrializers, right? And risking the alliance between the peasantry and the working class. So in 1928, to all intents and purposes, Stalin takes that program. He even takes the language of that program. If you read Stalin in 1928, he talks about the only way we can go forward, the only way we can industrialize is through unequal exchange between the countryside and the town. And that means exacting tribute from the peasantry. This is exactly the sort of idea that Preobrazhensky came out with in the New Economics, of where he put forward the idea of what he called primitive socialist accumulation. Obviously, it's based on Marx's writings in Capital, but applied to the conditions in the Soviet Union in the early 20s. Well, that might have been his idea. Who knows? I suspect it was his idea. But having gone not for voluntary collectivization, but forced collectivization, the communists in the countryside were given targets, and when they achieved 20%, they were told that's not enough. When they achieved 30% collectivization, they were told that's not enough. And there was a drive, basically, in the first 5-year plan to all intents and purposes for 100% collectivization. Now, the best account I've read of this period is by a Stalinist. I don't know if anyone else has read Sholokhov. Sholokhov wrote a brilliant book which won a Nobel Prize called Quiet Flows the Don. It's about I can't remember his name, but he's a Cossack. He's the hero of the book. At one moment he's on the side of the whites, then he's on the side of the reds, then he's on the side of the reds, then he's on the side of the whites. So it's a better book than I'm telling it, but it gives you the idea of this particular class of people vacillating from one side and the other, and the human drama that was involved in it. Anyway, he wrote a book called Virgin Soil Upturned, and this was his account of this sort of place in Ukraine. That's where he knew. And what he described is a situation of when it was announced there's going to be collectivization, the peasants ate their means of production. They didn't eat the scythes, but they ate the pigs, they ate the chickens, they ate the horses, they ate the cows, they ate anything they could. Sholokhov describes the peasants as all bloated and eating and eating and eating as much as they could stuff into their stomachs, because these peasants viewed those chickens as theirs. And the idea of giving them away, that's how they viewed it, as not just giving them away, but that having them stolen was objectionable to them. As I say, this is a Stalinist account, so I don't think it's an exaggeration. And we know the statistics. We know that if you take draft animals, we know if you take cows, if you take pigs, if you take sheep, there's a massive drop in the Soviet Union. So it's quite clear that they did eat them. We also know that there's a massive decline in the amount of grain that's harvested. To the extent, yes, the cities, including Moscow, Petrograd, Leningrad, so many name changes, but including those two cities, crucial cities to the regime, people are going hungry. They're not starving, right, but they're certainly going hungry. But we do know that they did starve in certain areas, Ukraine in particular, but also in other parts. And this is mass starvation. And it wasn't just a question of Stalin forcibly collectivizing. He also forcibly expropriated a particular class. He actually talked about liquidating the kulaks as a class. If you were classified as a kulak, not only was all your property confiscated, you were booted out of the village. You were made into a definite second-class citizen. And if you were lucky, yes, you were booted out of the village. If you were unlucky and considered a danger to the regime, you were sent to the gulag, which is basically prison labour. I mean, that's it. These are the most productive farmers. And again, Sholokhov in his book has got, I think, slightly more subtle take on these politics than Stalin actually had. Actually describes, yes, these kulaks are exploiters, and he describes their exploitation of poorer peasantry, but also the poorer peasantry are often dependent on the kulak and often related to the kulak. This is not just some alien class in the village that lives in some big house. They are your more prosperous next door neighbours, right? You might resent them, but you also envy them, right? And also, as I said before, you could be dependent on them. Okay, So we have the first 5-year plan. Now, as I said, Stalin's aim, and I'm sure it's true, was to have a situation of where peasant production was maintained, even increased. Peasant incomes, yes, would be squeezed, but certainly he was not out. I mean, there are ideas that he deliberately provoked a famine in Ukraine. I mean, I'm not going to go there. But I'm taking him on his word sort of idea that he went into the 5-year plan with just the conviction he was going to use this to industrialize the Soviet Union, and he had unintended consequences. Now, the unintended consequences were not only in the countryside with the massive drop in agricultural production, it was also in the cities. So what you saw in the 1920s, if we call that NEP, was not only a rise in production, agricultural production, but also a rise in urban wages. Workmen, that's not to over-egg it, the conditions began were absolutely appalling during the Civil War. But throughout the period of NEP, urban wages are going up. What happens with the first 5-year plan? I've got a little graph here. I think it's reasonably accurate. What happens to urban wages is something like, it goes actually below, right? And then it does a bit of that. This is the bottom 1932. So workers are also having tribute extracted from them. Okay, you might want to call this, and it'd be perfectly legitimate to call it, it was a cock-up. You know, okay, I didn't know that the kulaks were the most productive and they were responsible for the surplus agricultural production. I didn't know that that would trigger starvation. I didn't know that we couldn't really feed the cities. But it's quite clear that they have a campaign to reduce real wages. There's inflation, and inflation in terms of wages does not keep pace with prices in the shops. But I would argue for something more than just cock-up. In my understanding, the way I would describe it, is that what we're dealing with here is counter-revolution within the revolution. The regime retains its same outward appearance, but internally it changes. It changes from what I could broadly concede, although I'm quite open to an argument on it. You could broadly describe what existed in this period as a degenerate workers' state, if you want. Maybe the working class could have won reform within that system. I don't know. I'm not particularly hung up on the term, but I think it's at least a starting point. But once you're there, I don't see how you can describe that as any sort of workers' state, because we're not just dealing with a drop in living standards, we are dealing with a different political regime. The trade...
1928 or something?
Well, this is launch of the 5-year plan, right? So the 5-year plan, this is NEP, 5-year plan, 5 year. If I spell it wrong, please tell me. Right, so this is the 5-year plan. So yes, what I'm describing there, as I said before, is not just a drop in living standards. If you take trade unions, they cease being organs of working class defence and struggle. And they were restricted, but nevertheless within the workplace, trade unions exercise power on behalf of the working class. It's sort of a leftover from that debate between, what was it, Lenin, Trotsky, Bukharin, over the militarization of labour, trade unions and all that sort of stuff. Basically, Lenin argued that in a situation of work, I think he called it a workers' state, but with bureaucratic deformations or something like that, he insisted that the working class needed its own independent trade unions. They should not be state trade unions, right? Anyway, they changed. These trade unions now became organs of management. You also had the resort to forced labour. Throughout this period, and you can read anti-communists writing about it. So they're not people who hate Lenin, who think that Lenin led to Stalin sort of type idea. If you read about prison conditions in this period, you can read statements, yeah, conditions pretty shitty, but you're in prison because we're going to rehabilitate you. You're in prison because we're going to intimidate you because you're a counter-revolutionary, right? We are not allowed to force prisoners to work. What happens after this is they arrest, I don't know how many kulaks, maybe 600,000 or whatever the figure happens to be, but they also arrest lots of other people. And what you then have is a situation where gulag labour, prison labour, actually becomes an important economic factor in the economy. Now, again, we don't know accurate figures, and even with the opening of the archives, we don't know exactly the actual numbers. Lots of things have been lost, and then you get into definition, what is forced labour? You can have a situation, for example, if you read John Scott, who's an American who goes over to Russia full of dreams, and he stays a true communist, I think, to the end of his life, from my memory. He goes to Magnitogorsk. It's a complete nothing. It's a magnetic mountain, and they build this huge steel plant. It's an American-designed steel plant. It's the biggest in the world. He goes there, and what he describes is the different sorts of workers, and amongst those workers are a whole pack of kulaks who aren't trusted by the regime, always blamed if something goes wrong. But they are not there voluntarily. They're not like John Scott. They're not there for the wages. They're not there for the dream. They are there because they have to be there. Anyway, figures that I've read, and these are the latest sort of type figures, estimate that by 1953, this is at the death of Stalin, something like 20 million people were subject to forced labour. In some concerns, the death rate was staggering. I mean, officially, something like it was something like 10 or 20% of workers would die in any 1 year. That's in extremis, but also those are official figures, and you can read figures that actually say, well, in certain areas, the only people that survived would be the guy in charge of the work team and his mates. The rest die, and you get more in. If we take Stalin, he also institutes a terror. The secret police are given a quota of people to arrest. So you're not only arresting real enemies, you're arresting not even imaginary enemies. What you have is the routine use of torture to confess, to exact confessions. I mean, again, you can read accounts. The best way to resist, by the way, is tell them anything they want to know. And some guy just named everybody he knew. And I think he went, I don't know, maybe he had a photographic memory and just went through the Moscow telephone book and just said, well, and even the police went, oh, fuck that, yeah, well, we can't arrest all of those people. But you get the idea that what we're dealing with here isn't just, as I said, an economic cock-up with the 5-year plan. We're talking about some other system coming in to being. Now, in terms of, in terms of industrialization, let's just deal with that. It did start to work. There's no doubt that we do start getting, but certainly by the second 5-year plan, results start to come through. We also see the first beginnings of mechanisation. We see the recovery in the countryside. Living standards in the countryside, which were always bad, stay bad, but they don't go back except in World War II and at the end of World War II back to starvation levels. They remain bad. Industrial wages in the second five-year plan start to go up. I'll come to that in a second, I think. Tell me I've got 10 minutes left. No, good. Okay. Now, just have a look at that. We see that sort of pattern. World War II, we see another sharp downturn, by the way. Just also worthwhile mentioning that Stalin also initially here actually reduces the hours worked by workers. He's basically outflanking Trotsky, I think, there, because he introduces longer hours there. He also introduces, which sounds really very rational, the sort of continual working. And I think he sort of doesn't quite abolish the week. But what you have is Ben goes to work on a Sunday, and you go to work at 8 o'clock. I'm his wife, or I'm his husband, and we never meet each other sort of type idea. So it was quite a nice idea of getting things going, except the workers were a bit pissed off about not meeting their wives, husbands, or whatever. Anyway, that one aside. What I'm arguing for, anyway, is that this five-year plan has a social content. The state, the bureaucracy, lifts off and separates itself from the working class. The working class in that system is an exploited class to which the ruling elite look to extract surplus product. Right? The working class is no longer, except in name, the ruling class, except when it comes to constitutions and flim-flam. Right? It is not a workers' state. It is not a degenerate workers' state. It is not any kind of workers' state. On the other hand, is it capitalism? Of course not. Right? You have something, you know, at the end of the week, they hand you out rubles. Have a ruble, right? But this, in Marxist terms, I say this, the ruble is not money. Any Marxist will tell you why. It cannot buy the means of production. Indeed, it could buy you very little. What we know in the Soviet Union is who you know. You go into a shop, you know, I know Ben, and nothing in the shop, not a rare experience, right? I go in the shop, wink, he gives me my £half or kilo of sausages. They're not very good sausages, but you've saved them for me. I think it's called, is it Paul? Blatt? Yeah. Anyway, that's how the system works, and it works also up to the elite. Right? So it's not how many rubles you've got in your pocket, it's who you know, what connections you've got. It also ought to be pointed out that what we have more or less from there is full employment. Obviously a fact, and it was a fact, that was made much of by the regime. This is, after all, coincides with the 1929 crash, right? Made much of by the regime and by communist parties throughout the world. Look at the Soviet Union, compare it with the United States, where millions are unemployed, suffering the degradation of unemployment. Look at Germany, look at Britain, look at the poverty of the working class. Right? In Russia, you had full employment. A couple of million people who are unemployed almost instantly are put to work. You also have huge numbers of kulaks easily incorporated into these new plants and construction sites that are opening up. And indeed what you get almost straight away in terms of what enterprises are concerned, you get a labour shortage. Now I just think that we need to put this into social context. I don't know how many unemployed slaves there were in ancient Rome. I don't know how many unemployed slaves there were in Athenian silver mines, right? So here's a system that is not working according to the law of value. It's extracting use values. It's interested in use values, right? It's got no interest in having resources that are available to be exploited, standing there idly when they could be producing use values. Also, it should be pointed out that because we get hunger in the cities, the regime actually introduces things like workplace canteens. Enterprise managers are very concerned to keep their workers happy. The regime introduces a big education drive, right? It is very concerned, at least about some of its citizens. I'd actually say the majority of its citizens. It does not want people starving, right? It wants its slaves, and I use that term, it wants them to be productive. It is not aiming to kill people off. But also what we've got here, which I think is important to emphasise, is something that could be called negative workers' control. Right? Because there's a labour shortage, what we have, this is Stalin's word, what we have is worker gypsies. Right? You go, I start work at Enterprise A with Ben as the boss. He's quite a good guy. You know, he tries to keep me happy, but fuck me. I'm pissed off with that. I go to plant B. Well, a bit better. I go to plant C, I go to plant D, I go to plant E. I'm constantly on the move. You train me up to do one thing, I move. You had a massive, massive, massive labour turnover. They start to introduce laws to prevent people leaving an enterprise. But the problem is, I mean, this is something that Tony Cliff doesn't understand. If you read his book, State Capitalism in Russia, he talks about terrible repression in Russia. It's no doubt true. But what he doesn't understand is why does Stalin, why does the regime issue decree after decree after decree after decree, for example, against workers moving their place of work? You ask the question, you sort of already know the answer, because they keep doing it. Right? Whatever laws, whatever punishments you threaten people with, they keep doing it. And why can they keep doing it? Because it's in the interest of the manager to at least connive with the new worker. I've got a labour shortage. Ben turns up on my front gate. I'm not going to turn him away and say, where did you come from? Piss off and go back. I am desperate for labour, because what we have is a system of targets. So what I would argue Stalin introduces is a system of what you could call plan value. I would call target value, it doesn't really matter, call it whatever you will, of where you're judging everything according to quantity, right? Factories, enterprises were given a target to fulfill, and if they didn't fulfill it, the manager was in trouble. So managers did everything they could to fulfill targets. They needed workers, therefore, to at least to cooperate to some degree. And in that sense, you also needed to placate workers. So if we look at the Soviet Union historically, let's see if we can do that. Historically, you get some interesting phenomena. This is just rough. This is living standards. So right, that's sort of thing that goes on. We take that mid-1980s and that 1928. This is World War II, and what you get is that. Also what you get, which is interesting, worthwhile thinking about, is you get ordinary workers on the factory floor having a higher wage formally than engineers, right? So engineers might start, well, this is not really very accurate, so fuck it, doesn't matter, but you get the general idea. That's what happens. So what you get in terms of official pronouncements is against what they called equalization. You know, in Marx's writings, you're talking about the aim of socialism is to abolish wages, and before that the Bolsheviks talked about what we'll do is drive wage rates together, so you get something like either 4 different wage rates or 8, something like that, but the idea is to do that. Stalin said, this is all anti-Marxist rubbish. What we've got to do is actually have a campaign against equalisation, and we've got to give people an incentive to become an engineer. Well, okay, if that's the ideology and that's the drive of the regime, what's that about then? The regime is saying that's bad, or it should be like that. But the workers, nevertheless, are winning higher pay, better conditions. Better conditions, in that sense, for a nicer life in many respects than an engineer. So what is going on? I would say that's the result of negative workers' control. How many more minutes have I got? About 5? Whew, whew. Okay, be very quick. What we also get is what you can describe as a peculiar form of accumulation. What we have throughout the history of the Soviet Union is more and more stuff is being produced. No doubt about it. Steel, I don't know when it becomes the world's leading steel maker, cement, you name it. It outproduces the United States. And yet that existed side by side in terms of everybody's ordinary life with chronic shortages. So here you are, more and more stuff being produced, and yet people's lives were completely plagued with shortages of basic necessities. That also applied to enterprises. So enterprise managers would be in a situation, I meant to build a hydroelectric dam. The cement hasn't turned up. This is a constant problem for them. Now, when I visited the Soviet Union, I can't remember how old I would have been, 16, something like that. It was in 1970 or something like that. Anyway, long time ago. I was very impressed. I went to Moscow, lots of big Stalinist Gothic type buildings all over the place. Zurich, he's not here at the moment, we've got a big bugger type one of them in the middle of Warsaw. The locals hated it, by the way. They like it now that the Soviet Union's gone. Anyway, what was characteristic about Moscow, what really impressed me, was all the building that was going on. They're rebuilt, you know, everything's going up, and you went through the other outside Moscow, building work, big projects. What happens when Gorbachev gets in the 80s? He turns around and says, we're cancelling these building projects, because what we have is a situation of where, say in the West, it takes you 5 years to put up building X. In the Soviet Union, it took them 20 years. In the West, where you take 5 years to build a factory, in the Soviet Union, it took them 20. So you go and buy your latest American plant, or German plant, or Italian plant, you take 20 years to put it up, and then you're producing a car that's not quite an antique in the West, but my parents used to drive Ladas, which are old when they first came out, Italian Fiats, right? Now, so therefore, what we've got, as I said, is a peculiar form of accumulation. More and more stuff is being produced, and yet in terms of the society as a whole, that coincides also with chronic shortages. Okay, just a couple of minutes. Now, in terms of this form of development, what was also characteristic about it is that, and again, you can read all this in the reports of general secretaries and prime ministers. There's no fancy theory. You can read it in, Molotov, Stalin, Kosygin, Brezhnev, Gorbachev. It's great stuff. Read their 5-year reports, read their reports to party congresses. What they say is that in terms of we're importing all this machinery from Germany. Characteristically, what the enterprise manager would do is, I just produce this new machine from Germany, a lathe or something like that, characteristically what they do, because it's super fast and it's computerized, it's delivered to the factory gate, it's left at the factory gate. And you can read speeches by these guys saying, why are managers leaving out in the snow and the rain valuable equipment that we've paid for with valuable hard currency? This isn't happening once. Why are you doing it? And the reason they're doing it is because they don't want, one, higher targets, because you put in a new machine and a Gosplan or whatever it is says, well, we'll increase your targets. The workers are quite content with the old ways, and the manager just finds it a lot more convenient to report to his superiors, and it usually was a he, well, I haven't yet managed to introduce the new machinery, so we don't want any higher targets. So what the authorities did, the way they are able to advance and increase production, is what we do is we open up a new enterprise. And what we do is have new machinery, and we get hold of new workers. And that will be substantially more productive than the last one. But what you can't do, and this is what they found, is you cannot introduce new technology, new working practices in that factory. You've got to build another one. That's all very well. Okay, everything's a building site. You know, so you're building, your new steel plant is using up the steel of the old steel plant, that sort of type idea. But also what you're relying on, and this is again openly admitted by top Soviet officials, is relying on new supplies of labour. Now, while there were any housewives left, you could draw people from the house. While there was a surplus of some kind in the countryside, you could take from the countryside. So what you ended up with is still huge numbers of people working in the countryside, but they tended to be older, and they tend to be older women, right? So again, these people are not natural combine drivers with new technology that you hear about on the Archers, for example. So what we have is the statement from people like Brezhnev: we are running out of people. We need something like, this is what they say, we need 20 million more people if we're not going to run into big trouble. They didn't get 20 more million people, because what you had is the double burden on women. They work full-time, right? They tended to go for one child. And although you had incentives for them to have big families, they declined that temptation, right? So what you had is basically a population that was static or starting not to increase. That was it. So the obvious answer, they said, is we've got to introduce new technology. Well, we've already seen the problem with introducing new technology. They couldn't. So having said that, I think you've got an idea in terms of very rough outline why the Soviet Union came to an end, why it had to come to an end. It could not be rescued by new technology. It could not be rescued in terms of its internal laws. As a social formation, I would therefore describe it as not capitalist, not socialist, but a freak society that was born out of the failure of the October Revolution to spread into Western Europe, the inevitable failure of a system that could not base itself on working class democracy controlled from below, that run on control from above, and the atomization and exploitation of the masses without capitalism's law of value. That system initially showed advantages in the 30s, in World War II and all the rest of it, but inevitably had to come to an end. Well, next year will of course be the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution. And I'm sure there will be loads of learned books, and many not so learned books on that subject. I'm sure that there will be TV documentaries on that subject. I'm sure the left will write lots of articles on that subject. We need to do the same. We need, in that sense, to re-examine 1917, its heroism, its failure, and what the answer is next time. Anyone who has an idea that the bourgeoisie has forgotten Stalin or forgotten the failure of the Russian Revolution will somehow let us off when it comes to fighting the class war is living in cuckoo land. They will use the Russian Revolution and what happened to it as one of their most powerful weapons to bludgeon would-be revolutions. Don't you know what happened last time? That's the message. Don't mess with the natural order. We need to counter that, and we need to counter that not with sentimentalism, not by blaming Stalin personally. It might have been better or less worse if someone else had been head of the Communist Party, but you cannot, right, to quote Stalin of the early 1924, you cannot have socialism in one country. You cannot even have working class rule for very long in one country. It will go down, and it will either go down heroically, as the Paris Commune did, or it will go down from counter-revolution from within, which is what happened in the Soviet Union. Rubles were partial money, right? So you had to pay rent, but the rents they charged were pretty much a joke. Going on the metro in Moscow was a joke. You paid 1 kopeck, which is about a penny. Why they bothered collecting it, I don't know. But yeah, you could buy clothes, but you couldn't buy the clothes you wanted. So I remember when I went to the Soviet Union, if you were wearing, it used to be in those days, Levi's, right? People would come up to you and offer you huge amounts, either in dollars or rubles, right? Because they wanted Levi's. Beatles records, oh, they were hot stuff. So I'm not saying they were worthless. I'm just saying that what they could buy compared with the West was constricted. And yes, it was who you knew all the way through. So to buy a Lada car, you had to pay money, but there was a queue to get it, right? So you might have to wait a year or 2 years before you handed over your money. So if you knew the official that's in charge of the queue, right, that was an advantage. All I'm really trying to say is that the system, right, did not plan for engineers to have less rubles than ordinary manual workers, right? So we have to have another explanation other than the generosity of the system. The system fought against that all the way through. So this is anti-communist, detrimental, and yet workers got higher and higher pay. So I'm not saying that they were worth less. They were partial money. It's worthwhile noting, in reply to Phil, not that Lenin was advocating it, but in the debate over the programme, Lenin insists on maintaining the minimum programme because the Bolsheviks might have to fight under conditions of capitalism. So he recognised that possibility. But I mean, quite frankly, you know, if you're in the conditions of Russia in 1917, you're hanging on. And in that sense, Lenin was perfectly aware of the problems he faced. He was well aware of the degeneration of the regime, painfully aware. I don't think at some point you would then sort of get up in a Congress and say, oh, let's abandon you know, Communist Party rule. You know, it wasn't working class rule. I'm talking about in the early 20s, and let's go to capitalism. The reality of one doing that, I suspect you'd be taken outside and shot, first of all. That's the first result I would expect. But secondly, the idea that the restoration of capitalism would be a nicey-nicey sort of option, I think is nonsense. Capitalist restoration would be something along the lines of what the Nazis did in Russia. You'd have the massacre of cities. So that's what white counter-revolution would have been. I mean, it would have been a massive pogrom. They would have killed millions. It wouldn't have just been, oh, the Bolsheviks shuffle off to Switzerland and then the capitalists say, oh, we'll take over. There would have been millions of deaths. So I think what you are in is a historically tragic situation of which there is no positive way out. You know, what you can say things did not need to be as bad. You can say that if the communists had retained the idea of making the world revolution, but then again, we're getting into counterfactual history, and what I'm trying to do is actually look at what actually happened and why it happened, not this could have happened, that could have happened, that could have been different if the Germans had only made the revolution. Then I just create a science fiction sort of world. I am actually trying to locate why the Soviet Union collapsed and why it worked in the way it did. It did work, and it also malfunctioned. I'm trying to explain both. Okay. Well, Rod, you didn't really say anything. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So yes, it won in World War II. Okay, so where does that take us? I don't know. Getting back to Anne, so going back to the beginning. I mean, I readily accept that there was discontent with NEP, and it is worthwhile pointing out that in launching the 5-year plan, especially amongst young workers, right, and I would have thought intellectuals, but especially amongst young workers, there was huge enthusiasm for this. This went hand in hand with, you know, it has echoes of Mao's Cultural Revolution in terms of down with bourgeois culture, down with bourgeois music, down with bourgeois science sort of type rhetoric, down with bourgeois experts. Don't let the planners tell us what to do. Let the workers take command. All of that. So I'm not trying to simply say that 1928 and the launch of the 5-year plan, that was just horrible and exploitative. There's another side to it. It begins, at least with sections, with great enthusiasm. That does not last very long. That has to be said. It's also true that if you take the older workers, the existing generation of workers, they seem to, in terms of the evidence we have, to simply have viewed it as a speed up. That this is just squeezing us for more. They did not like it. So, but I'm trying to emphasise this was exciting. And you get people like John Scott, many others from abroad, not least America, right? Loads of people going to the Soviet Union because they're building the new world. That definitely existed. You know, there was a global enthusiasm for the first 5-year plan. And what happened afterwards? The Webbs, Beatrice and Sydney, go there. They've seen the future. Their book, Soviet Communism, I don't know what edition, but the early editions, Soviet Communism, ? The edition I've got, I think, which is 35, the question mark has gone. Soviet Communism, the new civilization. Viewed it as the future. And you can see it from a Fabian point of view. There it is, top down. There it is, obey orders. There it is, planning. There it is, centralization. There's the rationality. Seemed to work, and it did attract lots of people. But we know it came to an end, and we know that in the 30s, Trotsky's writings, it reminds me in a certain sense in this period of the Communist Manifesto. Some people, if they only read the first bit of the Communist Manifesto, will think Karl Marx was an enthusiast for capitalism. Trotsky's opening description of the first 5-year plan is a paean of praise. This proves the victory of socialism, not in the pages of Capital, I can't remember the exact words, but in cement, in miles of, or kilometres, whatever they said in those days, kilometres of rail track laid, in steel plants built, etc., etc. But then he gets, yes, to the nub of it, and he is able to locate the contradiction between quantity and quality. Now, it's also true, as Jerry would tell us, that Trotsky hung on to the description that this was a degenerate workers' state to the end of his life. I'm well aware of that. But he was wrong. That's all I would say. I mean, okay, he was wrong. We've seen it collapse. We've seen what happened. And we have got information that Trotsky did not have. Trotsky was looking at things through, how should I put it, many sheets of frosted glass. The information we had then coming out was very fragmentary. There's all sorts of, bourgeois lies being produced by the lie machine. The purges, well, he knew that his own comrades were being killed, but didn't he welcome the original trial of the bourgeois experts, the engineers? Trotsky did not have 100% information. But what I would say, what the tragedy to me of Trotsky is not Trotsky, he got it wrong, he got it wrong. The tragedy is that those that still speak in the name of Trotsky insist on repeating a mistake. Surely it's not obligatory for us to repeat the mistakes, even the one so intelligent and brave as Trotsky. I mean, I don't think the GMB works. The GMB might be a horrible bureaucracy, but it doesn't go around shooting and exploiting its membership. Well, I mean, if it did, if it turned itself into a capitalist firm or into a bureaucratic firm, or if it turned its members into slaves, would we then feel obliged to defend the GMB? I don't see why. No, I'm serious. I don't see why. That does not mean you join with the other side. I mean, are we meant to join Nazi Germany then? I mean, sorry, I don't see this either or. You must do this or you must do that. You can actually say that the Soviet Union is exploitative. It is fighting, you could say, it is fighting a war for survival. The imperialist bourgeoisie are fighting a war for domination. Meanwhile, those people in occupied France, occupied Holland, right, occupied Poland, are fighting a war of national liberation. I'd actually say you've got a combined war. And it isn't it is not a rerun of World War I, where you have pretty static battle lines, at least in the West. I mean, it goes a bit that way, it goes a bit that way. Okay, Belgium is occupied, but okay, sorry about that. But, what we have in World War II, I think, is more complex. And I don't have a problem, therefore, in opposing the Nazis, right? But that does not mean I need to call the Soviet Union a workers' state. I just don't see why. Now, I know in biology, old-fashioned biology likes to classify things as this, that, and all the rest of it. Okay, it's a pity we haven't got any comrades, I don't think, from platypus. Okay, define a mammal for me. Well, give birth live, for example. That'd be one feature. You can look up in a biology book. Therefore, a duck-billed platypus is not a mammal. Okay. We now know, by the way, it's me getting really carried away in my little boyhood type interest. What's a lizard? A lizard is cold-blooded. Well, okay, it's cold-blooded, isn't it? So we used to think, and that's their names, we used to think dinosaurs were lizards. We now know that they weren't, they were warm-blooded. Does that make them mammals? I know, but I'm just trying to play the game. Either or. Either or. Why? Why can't it, precisely as Mike shouted out, why can't it be a bird? Because that's what dinosaurs are, right? They aren't mammals. They're not mammals, are they? No, they're not lizards. They're birds, right? And we need to. Then if you said, what are birds? Birds, Yasmin, birds fly. Ostriches aren't birds. Penguins aren't birds.
There isn't a class called the freaks.
Oh, study it. You can call it what you want. All I'm urging people to do, all I'm urging comrades to do, is not start with the answer, it must be this or it must be that. What I'm urging comrades to do is study the duck-billed platypus, study the bird, study it. Don't start with the answer, engage in the process of thought. That's what surely Marxists are obliged to do. In terms of Mike, the problem I've got with what you're saying, although no doubt there's a truth there in terms of multiple laws, right? The problem I've got with that is that the laws became more draconian. the punishment for not turning up for work, the amount of time that you were going to be punished for turning up to work late gets more and more severe. But anyway, whatever the explanation is, they had these laws available to them. What is noticeable in terms of those arrested, those sent to the Gulag, how few workers were sent. They were sent, but how few, right? All I'm arguing is that to explain that, you have to explain that the enterprise manager is not a capitalist boss. Neither is he, by the way, the equivalent of a shop steward, right? They connive with the workers, and they will connive with new workers who turn up without papers or the wrong papers. I'll sort it out for you, sort of type thing. That's really what I'm trying to say. So they passed these laws, but they didn't take these. The workers then they weren't reported by the boss. He would hide them. Right? He had no interest in saying, oh, I'll send you to the Gulag. Why? He wouldn't sack anybody. Even if you turned up late every single Monday, pissed, I'm not going to sack him. That's how things work. I connive with you, you connive with me. And at the end of the month, when the plan has to, or the targets have to be completed, we all go like hell for leather, and we produce famously TV sets that blow up, cars that have the engines thrown in, and all of the rest of it. Don't buy Soviet products if they were made at the end of the month. That's the famous. I don't know how you tell, by the way, but the quality became even lower, but the output was reached. Okay.
Friday,
Okay, but this was more severe. I readily accept it in terms of British industry, but this was far more severe. That's all I'm trying to say. Right, okay. Mike, in terms of turning point. Well, of course, you know, again, time. I mean, I would say that the Russian Revolution begins to degenerate from day one. I mean, really, what else would we expect? And there are many turning points towards that. That I accept. 1921 would be one of them, but there were other turning points, absolutely. But really what I'm arguing is that 1928 marks the point of no possibility of reform. That's really what I'm saying. And you're dealing with a system of exploitation of the working class, right? And vicious exploitation and vicious oppression. So I am saying, I do agree with Cliff, and you can find so much other evidence when it comes to the family, when it comes to trade unions, when it comes to prisons, when it comes to abortion. You know, that what we're dealing with here is something deep that's going on in society. And I think I've finished there. I don't know if I am a little late on time, but that's it. That's it.